I took an oath to defend the Constitution when I was 17 years of age, back in 1977. And when I took it, I did understand the Constitution. I wasn't a constitutional scholar. I know a lot more about it now than I did then. But I took that oath for a lifetime. It wasn't something I just did while I was in the Army.
Airborne too, right?
I was in the 101st Airborne for a stint. I spent 2 years in a artillery unit. My ears aren't as good as they should be. Self-propelled back in the height of the Cold War. And that's where I learned a lot about what was going on. Here we are with a nuclear unit, nuclear capabilities, and the security was non-existent. And I'm a young private in E2, E3, and I'm going up to the E8, and I'm saying, we're sitting ducks here. The equipment's broken, and no security. And he said, Shurtleff, drink the German beer, chase the women, and then go home. Well, I took a little bad advice, but I said, not too much chasing women. Drank a little bit of the beer, but I love this country. My dad served in the Army. He actually met General Patton in Sicily, and I met his son. I served under his son. I won't bore you with that. Let me get into the presentation. A history of the militia of the United States. The M word. We're not supposed to say the word militia, isn't it? The dreaded M word. So what does the Constitution say about the M word that we're not supposed to say in polite company? Well, the word militia is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution 6 times. Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 15. To provide for calling for, this is the powers of Congress, Article 1. To provide for calling the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. Okay? Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 16. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such parts of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So it was Congress's job to make sure the states had a militia. Still in the that has not been repealed. There's not one amendment that repealed that. Okay? Article 2, Section 2. The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into actual service of the United States. So the President can call forth the militia as well as Congress to repel invasion when you had a militia. We don't have one, unfortunately, and I'll get into that. Of course, we all know the Second Amendment, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of a free state. Has that changed any?
No.
And now there may be other things necessary for the defense of a free state. I'd say a moral majority, people that believe in limited government, and the other things. But a well-regulated militia, and it was the Second Amendment, not the 10th, not the 9th, but they're all important. So they thought it was important enough to make it the Second Amendment. And I like to tell people, the Second Amendment didn't give us a right, did it?
No.
We had that right. So when people say, and I've been guilty of it over the years, I have a constitutional right to do this or that. No, I don't. I have a right protected by the Constitution. Do you think those militiamen in Lexington say, well, gee, we don't have an amendment. We don't know if we can own these muskets or these weapons. Gee whiz, we should wait until we have an amendment that lets us do this. They're God-given rights, protected. And if you look into the Bible in both Old and New Testament, it's pretty clear that you had a right to defend yourself, protect your home. The Apostle Paul said that in the book, I think it's 1 Timothy, he said that if you don't provide for your family, you're worse than an infidel. And that didn't just mean food and lodging, it meant safety and protection. And Jesus said, sell your cloak and buy a sword. The sword was the assault weapon of the day. See? So, the Fifth Amendment also, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentation or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. So military people are under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It was probably called something different in those days. So militia, if they're actually being called out in the federal capacity, they're under that jurisdiction. So it was mentioned there numerous times. So another thing I think it's important to point out, when we have to be careful of what we say when it comes to the truth, we should never let the enemy determine who our allies will be, and we should never let them give us the terms, define the terms. Because if we do, we're going to lose. You know, if it's Agenda 21, let's call it what it is. Let's just call it a local land grab, you see. Because if you do that, you're not going to be able to, can't be truthful. So, the Militia Act of 1792, I'll read some of it here. This was passed by the Second Congress. Section 1, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled that whenever the United States shall be invaded or be in imminent danger of invasion from any foreign nation or Indian tribe, it shall be lawful for the President of the United States to call forth such number of the militia of the state or states most convenient to the place of danger or scene of action, as he may judge necessary to repel such invasion, and to issue his order for that purpose to such officers or officers of the militia as he shall think proper, and in the case of an insurrection in any state against the government thereof. So you can do a little search for that. Now I looked at your state constitution, and you had a convention, a state convention in 1938, and they rewrote the Constitution. That kind of puts to rest the notion that, oh, we don't have to worry about a federal convention because we have state conventions, and they're never a problem. But even in the New York Constitution, 1938, Section 12, the defense and protection of the state and of the United States is an obligation of all persons within the state. The legislature shall provide for the discharge of this obligation and for the maintenance and regulation of the organized militia. The word organized, that's an important word, right? And I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. Virginia, Article 13 of the Virginia Original Declaration of Rights in 1776, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, that standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty. And our founders all believed that. So we always had a small standing army. We had a good navy, thanks to John Adams, but we always had a small standing army, especially those stationed in the United States. The militia is not made up of private groups. Now you may call yourselves a militia if it's a local group, but you're not under the jurisdiction of the governor or the president of the United States. So some of these men may qualify for membership in a militia if it's ever established, but just a bunch of guys calling themselves the Nebraska Militia or the Militia of Maine or Militia of Montana is not, it's like Federal Express. That's a private company. That's not part of the federal government, right? No, and people know that. So the idea that just because this is a private entity, and these people are not going to obey, there's not a lot of discipline. It could be 20, 30 guys. Some of them may have military experience, some of them don't. So just calling yourself a militia. There are some groups that I'm very happy to talk about that decided to change the name of their groups to Initial Response, or there's a group in Maine, it's First Responders or Volunteer Responders, and they're well trained in first aid. They're trained in other things, dealing with emergencies, floods, and disasters, and types of things like this. And there's a group in the town of Ringe, New Hampshire, that I'm very familiar with. I'm very friendly with them. And they actually get the support of the police. Now, the guys wear camos. They've got some weapon training. A few of them might be veterans, some of them aren't. And, but they call themselves a constitutional defense group or something like that, volunteer group. They could be members of an organized militia at some point, but they're not, they don't call themselves a militia. And there's a lot of other groups. I know the Oath Keepers do some of that too, locally as well. And I'm glad to hear that. Militia is a very proud history. You know, when tourists come to Boston, in the Boston area, they see all kinds of militia history. So why should we be ashamed of using the word militia? Indeed, it's mentioned 6 times in the Constitution. The word republic, or the term Republican form of government, is mentioned once. And we don't have any trouble saying this is a republic, not a democracy. But we're afraid of the word militia. I'm not saying you folks are, but people in general. The first statue on the left there, to your left, is the famous Minuteman statue done by David Chester French. He's the same guy that did the Lincoln Memorial. The statue in the middle, that's the Bedford militiaman holding the oldest flag in North America, which you can see at the Bedford Library. That's only about maybe 15 years old. And it wasn't done by some right-wing extremist. It was done by some local sculptor. And of course, that's the famous Minuteman statue, Daniel Chester French, Henry Hudson Kitson, that stands at Lexington Green. And when your organization was in the initial founding meeting, it was in the shadow of this great statue. And some right-wing extremists, you know, Massachusetts has a reputation of being a Bible Belt fundamentalist fanatics run the state, right? John Kennedy, John Kerry, people like that. They even put the militia guy on the state quarter. Boy, what an extremist thing to do, right? So why should we be afraid of using the word militia? The liberals do it all the time. They're always expressing their love for the militia. So let me give you a quick little history. History of the militia in the United States. English settlers in Boston and other towns in the Massachusetts Bay Colony adopted the English militia system as their model for local defense. Every male colonist between the ages of 16 and 60 was required to possess arms and equipment and to drill with the town militia company. There were some exceptions to that. They always made some exceptions to it didn't all have to be. And the term able-bodied too. You had to be of sound health, and if you had an incapacity or whatever, that you didn't do it. In 1936, town companies were assigned to 3 regional regiments. Several prominent men in Boston, all with military experience, agreed that another type of militia organization was needed to better prepare militiamen for the defense of the colony. So they created the Ancient and Honorable Artillery, 1638. Have you anyone's ever been to Faneuil Hall in Boston? A few of you. If you ever go to Boston, I would recommend you go to the top floor of Faneuil Hall. It's the museum of this entity. It still exists. It's more ceremonial than anything else, but it could be something, again, it could be used in the military, in a militia sense. They trained the militia units on how to use artillery, cannons in those days, and later on artillery. But you have to call ahead. Just go online, look up Ancient and Honorable Artillery. They're not open all the time. It's a free admission. You really enjoy it. It's an incredible experience. The weapons they have up there are amazing. And most people don't even know the place exists, you know. So, you know what, the powder houses are sort of a sign of our proud militia history. I don't know, there may be some around the New York area, but this is where the militia of each town, they have militia in each town. Do we have militias in towns today? And sometimes the townspeople paid their own expenses. And in some cases, if you couldn't afford the expenses, then it was provided for you. The first one on the left is in the town of Dedham, Massachusetts, which goes back to 1636. It took me a while to find this. It was a map, and it was and one of the ladies in the historical society said, "Oh, you don't want to look at that. There's poison ivy everywhere." It's almost like they weren't proud of their history, but I found it. And the one in Milton, this is Milton, Massachusetts, just a little bit south of Boston. It abuts the city of Boston. That's where George Daddy Bush was born, and that was done during the War of 1812, and it's still standing. Okay, here's another on the left here. This is the one on the left is in Burial Hill in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where some of the earlier militia units in what became our country were formed. And then this one is the one in the middle is in Somerville, in the Somerville-Medford line, and there was a famous powder alarm where the British soldiers came out to take the powder from, and that's why they actually went out to Lexington to arrest John Adams and Sam Adams and John Hancock, and take the powder from the supply of the local militia. So again, and I'm sure there's some examples of powder houses around here. Today they'd be stored in, today they're armories, but these armories are not militia armories, they're National Guard, and it's National Guard, it's not the militia, and I'll talk about that. After the French and Indian War, many militia units were virtually defunct, but after the Boston Tea Party and the First Continental Congress and state provisional congresses, militia units were restored and minute companies were formed. And a minute company was almost like the Green Beret of the local militia. You had to be ready in a very short time, and you were drilled a certain way, and you probably had better tactics. And it was the Minuteman Company in Lexington that met the British on Lexington Green. And by the way, if you're ever able, and I have a friend, I get front row passes if you'd like to come. Last year we had some friends from Ringe. Their group came in uniform. There's like 15 of them. They do the reenactment on, it's always that Monday, the day they run the Boston Marathon. It's that Monday of that week it's not always on the 19th. And you have to get there like 4 in the morning, but they do it very realistic. It's incredible. It's a very realistic, and some of the houses are still standing. So I really recommend it. And if you like to go, give me a call, and we'll hook. I'll be happy to show you around. I'll be honored to do that. Well, so the first militia unit in what became the United States was formed in Virginia in 1632. The militia was used in the King Philip's War in Massachusetts and Connecticut, Rhode Island. I don't know if it spilled into New York too much. That was a war between the Indians, and the Christian Indians were also targeted by the non-Christian Indians. And it was a bloody war. About 20% of our population was lost, or at least affected by it. The French and Indian War, and that's where a lot of the leaders in the War for Independence got some training. For example, George Washington. Concord and Lexington, where they had new companies. Of course, Bunker Hill. And the Bunker Hill, the militia was from all over Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other parts of the region. In Ringe, New Hampshire, they marched. They got the alarm for the Lexington battle. By the time they got there, 70 miles, everything's over. They hung around until the Battle of Bunker Hill. And that's when the British realized that I think we have our hands full. They thought these militia people were just a ridiculous joke. And there's been some examples where the militia units aren't well disciplined and they don't have good leadership. They don't do very well in the field. That's been a criticism of the militia. The War of 1812, numerous battles throughout the Revolutionary War, and a lot of militia units, when the coast of Massachusetts and New England, most of the bulk of the army was fighting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia. It was militia units that did the work, especially the coastal militia units. The War of 1812, another time when there was a lot of British ships would just come up the coast, and they didn't plan to invade, but they would bombard. In the town of Barnstable, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, there was a company that salt processing place, and they said, if you don't give us money, we're going to blow up your salt. Well, guess what? They had 2 cannons, and they had to train. They called it the Committees of Safety, but it was a local militia. They said, come and try it. And the cannons, they saw the cannons and they backed off. And there's many other examples of how the militia was used in the War of 1812. There was a group called Sea Fencibles, too, in north of Boston, were sort of a militia unit. Mexican-American War and the Civil War, they were all used. And again, the War of 1812 posed some problems. I want to catch this. We've all heard Patrick Henry's speech. We're all familiar with that speech. Some of us probably can recite it. I had a chance to visit the church where he gave it just a few weeks ago. I had been there once before, and I think it's one of the most wonderful speeches ever made. But I didn't know why he said it. I'm thinking they want to get independence from England, I want to have you. And the lady that gave us the tour, I don't think she was an oath keeper or a John Bircher. She was just giving us true history. But what happened was the British governor, Lord Dunmore, disbanded the militia. The capital of Virginia was in Williamsburg. And the Patriots decided to have a convention, a state convention, and they were elected by the counties. And Patrick Henry was one of the delegates from the county he was from. And there was a lot of folks there that was pretty upset with the British were doing what they were doing, some pretty rotten things. So Patrick Henry offered a resolution to restore the state militia, which had been disbanded by the governor. And the man moderating it did not want to hear that, and he kept being persuasive. And he made the motion. George Washington not only said, I will support it, but I will personally raise 1,000 men and I will equip them and we'll march to Boston. So Washington was in on from the beginning, as well as Thomas Jefferson. And he gave that great speech, but it was the purpose of that speech was to restore Virginia's militia, which they did. You see, so I bet you most Americans don't know that. You know, did anybody know that in this room before? Yeah. Why didn't we know that? I should have known it. See? But they don't want you to. There's some great history that they really don't want you to know. And you can find it if you look hard enough. The War of 1812 raised a number of questions as to the extent of power over the state militia conferred upon the general government by the Constitution. Some maintain that the power conferred on the president to act as commander-in-chief of the state militia, one in the actual service of the United States, was a power personal to himself and could not be delegated. And as the appointment of officers has been reserved to the states, the militia, even when in the U.S. service, were under no obligation to obey anybody but the state authorities or the president in person. The governor of Vermont, Chittenden, went so far as to claim the right to order the militia of that state to return home if in his discretion he thought they were more needed home than in the front of the enemy who had invaded a neighboring state. In fact, he did try to recall his militia. He was not successful with that. I remember Michael Dukakis, the governor, ran president. Well, National Guardsmen would go to Central America to train, and all of a sudden he became a constitutionalist. He didn't want to see because their mission was not supposed to be outside the country. It was kind of interesting how every now and then they have appreciation for the Constitution. There's a picture of the governor here, Chittenden in 1812. And a lot of the militia units were not, they didn't have good training. And in some cases, in some of the battles in the Detroit area, they didn't do a very good job. But it isn't because the militia by its nature is bad, it's because you don't have good training and good leaders. I don't care what kind of equipment you have, you're not going to be very, very effective. Now there's another interesting chapter of our history that most people don't know. Even Edwin Vieira didn't know about this. The Aroostook War. I get up to Aroostook County on a regular basis, so I got to learn a lot about the Aroostook War. Anyone familiar with the Aroostook War? Well, there was disputed territory. And Canada was still part of, under the British Dominion, New Brunswick, and the woodsmen would come and chop trees in our territory and float them down the St. John River into Canada, and we tried to stop it, and they had their militia and some of their mounted, I don't know if they had mounted police in those days, they actually arrested a guy, an American citizen. So the governor, this is the proclamation, I won't read the whole thing, but he called out the militia in Maine. He said, one of our countrymen, one of our state's members has been kidnapped and held in prison, and we have an obligation to our honor of our state. He called out 10,000 militiamen. Now, the Maine had a population, I didn't realize it was this big, it was about 500,000 people back in 1848. And they had all kinds of patriotic fervor. They marched up there, they built Fort Kent, Fort Fairfield. Nobody was killed. It was sort of a standoff, thankfully, and that led to the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And within a few weeks, we did have some regular army kind of come up under General Winfield Scott. But it was the militia that was there first. And I would say the closest you are to the issue would be, and they were able to take care of business. I think it was a proud chapter in our nation's history. And this is, the militia system had already proven unreliable by the time of the Mexican War and had undergone substantial revision. Two issues emerged in the War of 1812 that demonstrated its flaws. First, many states prohibited their troops from participating in military operations on foreign soil. I don't think the militia should ever be on foreign soil unless it's some kind of hot pursuit, just like sometimes a policeman can't cross into another state unless it's hot pursuit. So I think that's legitimate. Second, by law, militiamen could only serve for a period of 90 days, meaning that recruiting, training, and marshaling occupied most of a unit's time with little left over for campaigning. Of course, the way to do that is just increase the enlistment for 2 years or a year and a half or whatever. That's sort of easily done. As a solution to this problem, Congress created a subclass of militia called volunteers who were not confined by these two restrictions on May 13, 1846. So that's how and by the time the Mexican-American War, there was only 4,000 to 5,000 soldiers in the whole army. You're going to declare war, don't you think you have a chance to win the war first? You think let's raise the army first, then we'll declare war. But they did the other way around. So, and by the way, there's something called the State Guard. I don't know if does New York have something called the State Guard? These things were created, they're not the militia, but when the National Guard is on a mission outside of the state, they're sort of like the reservist National Guardsmen, but they stay in the state. But they're not militiamen. Okay, Massachusetts has one. Now Lincoln, I'm not a big fan of Abraham Lincoln, like some of you may not be. Nevertheless, he used that law of 1792 to call forth the militia, and he asked for 75,000 men to put down the states that had seceded. Kind of interesting where Maine called out 10,000 in one state, relatively small as far as population, and Lincoln originally only called out 75,000, and he asked the governors to supply them. Now, the militia units were sort of waning. States didn't keep it up. Congress wasn't all that interested in maintaining the local militia. Then we had the war, the Spanish-American War, and that was the time when we became an empire. The United States, our founders, George Washington said, have nothing to do with permanent foreign entanglements. John Quincy Adams said that we are for everywhere the friends of freedom, but the protectors only of our own. It was a great policy. It was a wise policy. But that ended during the Spanish-American War when we became an empire. We have possessions in the Philippines, Cuba, and so forth. And a man by the name of Eli Root, the man on the left, he was the Secretary of War. They used to call it Secretary of War, now it's called Secretary of Defense. See, we used to win wars, and that's when we stopped winning wars after World War II, and we call him Secretary of Defense, right? He was also one of the early members of this organization. He was a big supporter of the League of Nations. He was an internationalist. And my good friend Dan McGonigal, who did a little research on this, I said, what motivated the Dick Act? Certainly this congressman from Pennsylvania on the right here, who became a U.S. Senator, didn't just wake up one morning and say, hey, I got an idea, an initiative, right? When you see the word initiative in a government, something behind it, that's when you run, don't walk to the nearest entrance, right? Because you know your freedom is on the chopping block, right? So the Dick Act changed the whole militia, and they redefined it, okay? It was known as the Militia Act of 1903, also known as the Efficiency in Militia Act, and also as the Dick Act. Legislation enacted by Congress which codified the circumstances under which National Guard could be federalized. It also provides, so they redefined the term. They call it National Guard, no longer militia, right? And by the way, states under Article 1, Section 10 can have troops. They can have their own, but it's different from, Massachusetts had something separate than the militia during the time of War for Independence, right? But they weren't militia separate, totally separate, okay? It also provided federal funds to the National Guard to pay for equipment. Anytime federal money comes, what also comes with it?
Control.
Control, yeah. Sometimes they use the word strings attached. I say chains are attached, not strings. Strings you can kind of break, right? But you can't break chains very easily. In return, the National Guard began to organize its units along the same lines as the regular Army. It took steps to meet the same training, education, and readiness requirements as an active duty units. Now, there's nothing wrong with, there was some problems that had to be addressed. But what Dick wanted to do was he now wanted the national, change it from militia to National Guard and change the mission of the militia to be used all over the world, you see. And that was the beginning of the end of what we call a militia. Now, James Parker was the first head of the Division of Militia Affairs. The Dick Act was amended several times in 1908. The 9-month limit on federal service was dropped, and the President was empowered to set the length of federal service. The ban on National Guard units serving outside the United States was also dropped. So you see how they do things gradually? Like they probably said, no, we're not going to send you guys over to the Philippines unless you join the regular Army. Don't worry about it. You know, just like NAFTA, it wasn't going to, we weren't losing any jobs. In Obamacare, you know, don't worry about it. You can keep your insurance if you want to keep it. The Federal Reserve System, it was only supposed to, the income tax, it was only supposed to tax 1% of the highest income. You guys won't be affected at all. So gradual. So 5 years later, now the militia, no longer a militia, it's a National Guard, and they can be sent out of the country at the whim of the President. Let's see, there was a National Defense Act, that sort of sealed the fate. Kind of interesting, right before involvement in World War I, so they really had to do that. The National Defense Act, 1916, is the most important piece of legislation in the history of the National Guard. Now, I got this right from a National Guard history thing, so it's not my own words. It transformed the militia from individual state forces into a reserve component of the U.S. Army and made the term National Guard mandatory. The Act stated that all units would have to be federally recognized and that the qualifications for officers would be set by the War Department. It increased the number of annual training days to 15, increased the number of years drills to 48, and authorized pay for drills. I suppose that didn't get too upset. Now, this is the current law, Title 10, Section 311. The militia of the United States consists of all able-bodied males aged 17 years of age, except as provided in Section 313 of Title 32, under 45 years of age, who are or have been made a declaration of intention to become citizens of the United States, and of female citizens of the United States who are members of the National Guard. The classes of the militia are: 1, the organized militia, which consists of the National Guard and the Naval Militia, and the unorganized militia, which consists of the members of the militia who are not members of the National Guard or the Naval Militia. Got that? Kind of confusing. Unorganized militia. And the American people bought that. You can't have an organized militia. In my neighborhood, I played a little bit, I played Little League Baseball. My neighbor across the street used to play on a tavern team, right? Are we an unorganized baseball team and we haven't played in years, right? Of course not. You know, what about doctors who never went to medical school and never had any experiences, but they may have watched a movie on, they watched Dr. Kildare or something on television. They're not unorganized doctors.
Just dated yourself.
You have to, I know, in the 1960s, right? You have to be organized. Part of being a militia is organized. That's an oxymoron. I remember saying, no, unorganized militia. But in Boston, when we had the marathon bombing, where was the unorganized militia? They were ordered to stay at shelter in place. Stay down, stay home. What good are you? If you're unorganized, you're really probably be a nuisance than anything else. So that was a major event here, the National Defense Act of 1916. So let's see if I have anything else here. Yeah. So what to do? Understand the U.S. Constitution. I think most of you do very well. We have a wonderful 6-part series called The Constitution is a Solution, and we encourage people to host their own these series. There's an incredible book by Mr. Edwin Vieira, and anything he writes, by the way, he likes to write long dissertations, but he gets some short things too. He's got one book, it's called The First 13 Words. First 13 Words of the Second Amendment. That's only about maybe 100 pages long. The New American did an article that reviewed his book called On a Militia Mission, article from the January 6, 2014 New American. I'll be happy to send you a copy of that in a PDF format or a link to it on the online article. Dr. Vieira is all over YouTube. Edwin Vieira, V-I-E-I-R-A, I think. And I've learned a lot from him. I got a chance to meet him on 2 occasions. Actually, I wish Mert was with us because he was up in New Hampshire and I taped him, but it was windy outside and a little, sometimes the sound didn't come across. And that's on my YouTube channel. What about this? Make organizing the unorganized militia a project of your group. How's that? Why can't the unorganized militia demand to be organized? Anyway, let me recommend some reading here. The Sword and Sovereignty by Edwin Vieira. That's a sort of a real massive book. It's actually available on a CD. So if you really want to get your hands around it, I have not read it, but I think I'm going to read it. So next time I give a talk on this, it will be about 2 hours long, or maybe 4 hours long. And anything by Edwin Vieira, I highly recommend. Videos and what have you. And the book that my friend of mine put out, Execute the Laws to Restore the Republic, it has a lot of articles by Edwin Vieira. It has a chapter from a constitutional scholar in the 1880s. The idea of martial law, there's no constitutional prerogative for martial law. Only the martial law, if you're in the military, are you under martial law. And I do say it will be challenging in states like New York. I don't know if I want to be under the orders of your governor, your current governor. So I do agree. It's an issue whose time has come. I think there are some states where you could do that. Definitely not Massachusetts. My colleague said, he said, you know, if a UN occupational team, soldiers, you know, landed in Boston Harbor, about 80% of the Massachusetts legislators would welcome them with open arms. I thought, you know something? I thought about that for a minute. I said, you're probably right. The same thing with New York. It's that mindset that people, that's why it's so important. We got to change people's, there's a lot of people who are indifferent, and we got to get them interested in what we do. And it's not just for our sake, but for their sake too. And I tell people, well, why are you involved in this? You know, I say, I have 5 reasons to call children. So with that, I want to thank you, and oh yes, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Yes, yeah, we can say that here, can't we?